found out my parents left everything to my brother in their will. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28, a nurse who has worked long hours my whole adult life, and until recently, I thought I had been a good daughter. I stayed close to home, made sure my parents were cared for, drove them to every appointment, and kept their fridge stocked when their health started slipping. My brother, Mark, lived out of state. He visited maybe twice a year, usually for holidays when it was convenient for him. But still, my parents praised him like he was the perfect son. I told myself it was just favoritism, nothing serious. When my parents passed, I wasn't prepared for what I heard at the lawyer's office. I sat there, hands folded, waiting to hear how everything would be divided. Instead, I listened as the lawyer explained that the house, the savings, the land, everything, had been left to Mark. My name wasn't mentioned. Not once. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I replayed every night I stayed awake watching over my mom when she couldn't sleep. Every time I picked up my dad's prescriptions after working a 12-hour shift. Every holiday I spent in their kitchen making dinner because they were too tired. All of it suddenly meant nothing. Mark sat across the table with that smug little grin, the one he used whenever he wanted me to know he had won. Afterward, when the lawyer left the room, he leaned toward me and whispered, "It's what Mom and Dad wanted." His voice was calm, almost mocking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. How could they see me give up so much of my life and still think I deserved nothing? But instead, I sat frozen. It wasn't just disappointment I felt. It was betrayal. The kind that cuts straight to the bone. I drove home in silence that day, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they hurt. My parents were gone, and all I had left of them was the realization that, in the end, I hadn't mattered enough. I had been invisible in my own family's story. For days I replayed it in my head, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe Mark would share. But deep down I knew better. Mark wasn't the kind of man to share. He had been spoiled his entire life, always handed everything while I was told to be responsible. Now, even in death, my parents had chosen him over me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I looked at our family photos on the wall, all I saw was a daughter who had given everything, and a brother who had given nothing, yet walked away with it all. That's when the anger finally settled in. This wasn't going to be the end of my story. This wasn't over. I used to believe that if I just kept giving, if I just kept showing up, then one day my parents would look at me and finally see me. Not as the daughter who could be counted on to clean up messes, but as someone worthy of their pride. I can remember the exact trips I gave up, friends begging me to join them in Florida or Vegas, and me turning them down because Dad had another test or Mom wasn't feeling well. I convinced myself it was the right choice. That family came before everything else. There were nights when I finished a 12-hour shift, and instead of going home, I drove straight to their house. I would sort their mail, pay the bills they left unopened on the kitchen table, cook enough meals to last the week. I carried their lives on my back without complaint. I told myself they noticed. I told myself they loved me for it. Then there was Mark. He breezed in like a guest, staying just long enough to pat Mom on the hand and let Dad tell him how proud he was. He never stayed to actually do the work. He'd leave behind dirty dishes, sometimes even laundry like the house was a hotel. Yet somehow, every time he left, Mom would smile and say, "Isn't he wonderful? He works so hard. We're lucky to have such a son." I can still hear her voice in my head, soft with admiration, like he had just saved the world instead of flying back to his life while I picked up the pieces. When I spoke up, when I tried to remind them of all the hours I was giving, they brushed it off. "You're just good at taking care of people, Emily. That's who you are." As if being dependable was the only identity I was allowed. I learned to swallow the sting, but it never really went away. I remember one winter when Dad slipped on the porch and couldn't walk for weeks. I drove across town every morning before work to shovel the driveway, then came back after my shift to help him into bed. Mark sent a card, and Dad held it like it was gold. "Your brother's so thoughtful," he said, beaming. I stood there, boots wet from snow, arms aching, wondering what more I could possibly do to be noticed. Every memory like that came flooding back after the will was read. It was like a cruel slideshow, each scene reminding me that no matter how much I sacrificed, it was never enough. My chest tightened with the kind of anger that doesn't burn hot but seeps in cold and steady. I wasn't just overlooked, I was erased. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking what I could do to earn their love. A different question took root instead, sharper, heavier. Why was I never enough for them, when he always was? The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the kind of place where words carried too much weight. I sat in a stiff chair, hands pressed against my knees, trying to prepare for whatever came next. The man across the desk cleared his throat, unfolded a document, and began reading in a steady monotone. With every line, my stomach sank lower. The house, the savings, the land, one by one, all listed under Mark's name. My name never appeared. Not once. I kept my face still, though I could feel the blood rushing to my ear. The sound of the words didn't even seem real, more like a nightmare I had stumbled into. All I could do was stare at the polished wood of the desk, tracing the lines in the grain as though they might lead me back to a reality that made sense. When the reading ended, there was a pause, a heavy silence that pressed down on the room. I didn't know what to say, what to ask. Before I could even gather my voice, Mark leaned back in his chair, lips curled just enough to make me want to look away. Then he tilted his head toward me and spoke in a low voice, almost like he was savoring the moment. It's what Mom and Dad wanted. Those words hit harder than the will itself. They weren't comforting, they weren't sympathetic. They were a dagger wrapped in silk, twisted just enough so I would feel the sting. He knew exactly what he was doing. That smirk wasn't casual. It was a celebration, a declaration that he had won and I had lost. I wanted to shout across the table, to tell the lawyer how wrong this was, how the balance of years and sacrifices had been ignored. But my throat closed up, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. I knew if I spoke then, the anger would spill out in a way that couldn't be contained. So instead I stayed quiet, forcing myself to breathe through the storm building inside me. I watched Mark gather his papers, his hand brushing against the leather armrest like he owned the world now. The confidence in his movements made my skin crawl. He didn't even glance at me again, as though I wasn't worth the effort. But inside, beneath the humiliation, something sharp began to form. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't even confusion. It was resolve. If Mark thought this was the end, he didn't know me at all. I wouldn't let his smirk be the final memory I carried out of that room. As I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the tile, I repeated one silent promise to myself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It didn't take long before Mark started moving pieces around like he was clearing a board game. I found out through a neighbor that a for sale sign had been hammered into the yard of our parents' house. No phone call, no discussion, no courtesy. Just a bold decision made as if the walls that held my entire childhood were nothing but numbers on a listing sheet. I drove over that same afternoon, standing at the curb staring at the bright red sign swaying in the wind. The house looked smaller somehow, stripped of warmth. Curtains I had helped Mom pick out were drawn tight, as if shutting me out. I stepped onto the porch and unlocked the door, my chest tight with dread. Inside, boxes were already stacked in the hallway. Mark's handwriting scrawled across the cardboard in thick black marker, kitchen, attic, garage. He wasn't just selling the house. He was dismantling our parents' lives piece by piece. When I walked into the living room, I caught him crouched near the cabinet where Mom had kept her jewelry. He held her silver locket in his hand, turning it over like it was a coin he could spend. That locket had been promised to me years ago, a quiet assurance from Mom in one of her softer moments. She told me it was mine because I had been the one to clasp it around her neck before every church service, the one to polish it when her hands grew shaky. "Put that back," I said, my voice low but firm. He didn't even flinch. "Relax, Emily. It's just jewelry. I'll keep it safe." Safe. The word twisted in my gut. He wasn't keeping it safe. He was claiming it, the way he claimed everything else. He set it aside with a dismissive flick, as if my connection to it meant nothing. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about money or property. He was erasing me. Every object that held a memory between me and our parents was being absorbed into his world, leaving me with nothing to prove I had ever mattered to them. I walked through the rooms after that, each corner filled with traces of my life. The dent in the hallway where I'd dropped a suitcase during college. The chipped tile in the kitchen from when Dad tried to teach me how to cook and spilled an entire pot. These weren't just flaws in a house. They were the map of who we had been as a family. And now, all of it was being packed away like clutter. By the time I left, I couldn't even look at Mark. My hands itched to grab every box and drag it back inside. But instead, I stood on the porch and realized something darker. If I didn't stop him, he wouldn't just take possession of the house or the money. He would take the very proof that I had ever belonged in this family at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The will didn't match the words I had grown up hearing. My parents weren't rich, but they had always been careful about fairness. Birthdays, holidays, even chores. Everything was measured, balanced, split down the middle. The idea that they would give everything to one child and leave the other with nothing felt wrong, almost unnatural. So I started looking. At first it was small things. I went through drawers stuffed with receipts, checkbooks, old insurance forms. I combed through folders stacked in dusty cabinets, every envelope carrying the smell of time. Late into the night, I spread papers across my kitchen table, searching for a clue that might explain the shift. I found a letter tucked between tax documents, written in my father's neat, slanted handwriting. It wasn't long, just a few lines about making sure the estate is split evenly between Mark and Emily. My chest tightened as I read it. The words were clear. That had been the plan once. So why had it changed? I called one of Mom's oldest friends, Mrs. Lawson, who used to have coffee with her every week. I asked if she remembered any talk about inheritance. She hesitated, then admitted that Mom often spoke about wanting both of us to be secure, that she worried about me working myself to the bone. She always said you'd both be taken care of, Mrs. Lawson whispered, almost like she was afraid to say it aloud. Piece by piece, the picture formed, and with it a shadow of doubt. If the intention had always been balance, then the sudden swing toward Mark alone wasn't natural. I began to wonder what had happened during those final months, when I had been drowning in hospital shifts and barely had time to breathe. I hadn't been around as much, but he had. He had shown up more often, called more, played the role of the dutiful son while I was away earning money to cover bills. The thought that he might have used that time to bend their trust made my stomach turn. I replayed every smirk, every careless word he'd thrown at me, and suddenly they took on a new edge. Maybe he hadn't just been lucky. Maybe he had shaped the outcome, whispered doubts into their ears when they were vulnerable, convinced them that I didn't need what he did. The more I thought about it, the more the possibility hardened into suspicion. This wasn't just an oversight. It felt like a theft, carried out quietly in conversations I had never been part of. And if he really had pulled their strings, then the betrayal ran deeper than I'd allowed myself to imagine. That night, sitting at the table surrounded by piles of paper and fading ink, I realized something important. If Mark had twisted the truth once, he could do it again. And the only way to stop him was to uncover exactly what he had done, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. It was during a visit with Mr. Harris, my dad's old fishing buddy, that the pieces began to fall into place. He sat across from me at his kitchen table, stirring sugar into his coffee, when he let something slip. "Your brother was around a lot more last year," he said casually. "Always talking to your folks about planning ahead, making arrangements." He sure sounded like he had everything under control. The words stung. I remembered those same months clearly, weeks when the hospital was understaffed, and I was working nights, then turning around for extra shifts during the day. I had barely been sleeping, barely managing to keep up with my own life. I wasn't there to hear what Mark was whispering in their ears. After that conversation, I started asking quiet questions, one person at a time. A neighbor mentioned seeing Mark's car in the driveway several evenings in a row. Another said he'd overheard my brother bragging about taking care of things, so that I wouldn't have to worry. The pattern grew sharper with every detail I gathered. Finally, I sat down with my parents' attorney, pressing for answers in a way I hadn't dared before. He hesitated, but eventually admitted that the change to the will had been made during a period when both my parents were under heavy stress. "Your brother was very involved in the discussions," he said carefully. "He told them you were financially stable, that you wouldn't need the same level of support." My chest tightened. I could almost hear Mark's voice feeding them those lines, convincing them that my endless overtime, my exhaustion, was proof of independence rather than necessity. He had painted my sacrifice as security, twisting my effort into a reason to cut me out. It wasn't chance. It wasn't some mysterious shift in my parents' hearts. It was deliberate. He had leaned on their fear, played the role of the dutiful son, and turned me into the unnecessary daughter. I sat in my car afterward, hands shaking against the steering wheel. The betrayal felt different now, sharper, heavier. It wasn't just that my parents had overlooked me. They had been steered, nudged into believing a lie. And the man who had done it was the same one who smirked across the table while I listened to everything vanish from my grasp. For years, I had carried the weight of caring for our family, believing that love and loyalty were in. But he had used those same values as weapons, twisting them until they left me with nothing. The realization sank in like ice. This wasn't fate, and it wasn't a mistake. It was his design from the beginning. Mark had stolen my parents' trust, and through it, he had stolen what little I had left of them. It started with the truck, a gleaming black pickup parked in Mark's driveway, so polished it reflected the sky. I drove past it one afternoon and felt my stomach twist. He hadn't wasted any time turning what he took into a trophy, something loud and impossible to ignore. Every time I saw it, I thought of the years I'd spent patching together bills, wondering if I'd have enough left for groceries after covering Mom and Dad's needs. Then came the talk about the house. He called me, his voice full of casual cheer, saying he had found a buyer willing to pay above asking. He spoke about profit margins, about flipping our childhood home like it was a stock trade. I listened in silence, my jaw tight. The place where we'd celebrated birthdays, where our parents had lived their entire adult lives, reduced to a quick sale for cash in his pocket. When I finally confronted him, it was in the driveway outside that shining truck. "You can't just sell everything without thinking about what it means," I told him, my voice shaking more with anger than fear. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, wearing that same smug expression I had seen too many times. "You're overreacting, Emily. It's just property. You should be grateful I'm handling it. Tell you what, if you ever get desperate, I'll help you out." Those words cut deeper than anything that had come before. Grateful, as if I should thank him for throwing me scraps from what he stole. He said it so lightly, like he was being generous, like I should feel lucky to have his pity. Something shifted in me at that moment. The years of swallowing hurt, of pushing down disappointment, of pretending I was fine with being invisible, they all boiled over. My brother had taken my parents' trust, turned it into power, and now he wanted me to kneel to him for help. I stared at him, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms, and I knew I couldn't let this continue. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just let the silence stretch until he smirked again and walked away, keys jingling in his hand. But inside me, a line had been crossed. I wasn't going to fade into the background while he paraded around with everything I'd been denied. That was the moment the decision rooted itself firmly in my chest. I wouldn't just watch him strip our family's history for profit. I wouldn't let his laughter be the last word. For the first time, I felt a clarity sharper than the anger itself. I was done walking away. From here on, I was going to fight. And Mark had no idea what was coming. I started collecting little things that, when put together, might become proof. Old notes tucked into books, appointment cards with my name on them, voicemails saved on an old phone. Everything that showed I had been the one who handled the day-to-day care. I knocked on doors and spoke to people who had seen our family through the years. The mailman who remembered delivering packages to my parents because I was often there to sign, the neighbor who'd watched me shovel the walk during a storm, the church volunteer who'd noticed I was the one always bringing food after someone was sick. Their memories filled gaps that the papers couldn't. I reached out to a small law firm recommended by a friend and explained calmly everything I had found so far. The attorney listened without interruption, then suggested formal steps I hadn't considered. Obtaining archived medical notes, requesting copies of any late changes to legal documents, and collecting sworn accounts from witnesses who could attest to who had been responsible for my parents' care. We planned carefully, wanting to avoid tipping off Mark too early. The goal was to build a quiet, solid record that would speak louder than anyone's boasting. Meanwhile, I began gathering digital traces. Old emails where my father thanked me for driving him to an appointment, texts from my mother asking if I could pick up groceries, small, ordinary messages that, when assembled, showed who had truly been present. I printed pages, labeled them, and stored everything in a neat folder. It felt strange at first, turning private moments into evidence, but the unfairness pushed me forward. I also spoke to people who had known Mark in recent months. Several admitted he had been unusually attentive, appearing every night and easing into conversations about plans and arrangements. One neighbor confessed she'd seen him sitting with my parents, leafing through papers while they looked tired and confused. Another remembered overhearing him suggest that Emily didn't need financial help because she worked so much. Those recollections were small but consistent, like threads that, when woven together, formed a pattern. With the lawyer's help, I filed requests for records and drafted statements with witnesses. We framed the challenge not as spiteful retaliation, but as a necessary inquiry into whether undue pressure had affected my parents' decisions during a vulnerable time. At the same time, I quietly began to undo Mark's public image in the small circles that mattered: friends, family acquaintances, and a few professional contacts who had previously admired him. I shared my concerns without spectacle, letting people know there were unanswered questions about how the final choices had been made. I didn't want a smash-and-grab attack on his character. I wanted clarity and fairness. Still, I knew reputation could be a lever. If those who respected him learned there might be more to the story, the pressure would build naturally. Financial leverage followed. The attorney advised ways to freeze transfers until the dispute was resolved and to flag large withdrawals that could be challenged later. Every step felt heavy and urgent. I kept thinking of small domestic details: unpaid calls, unpaid visits, the scarves folded in a drawer I had once mended, and how they contrasted with the neat, sudden claims Mark was making. The plan wasn't born from cruelty. It came from a need to restore balance, and to stop someone from rewriting our family's end for his own gain. I moved forward with careful hands and a steady purpose, ready to prove what had been true all along. The day of the hearing arrived heavy with tension. I sat at the long wooden table, documents neatly stacked before me, the lawyer beside me calm and focused. Across the aisle, Mark leaned back in his chair like he had already won, his tie knotted too tightly, his grin careless. He tapped his pen against the folder in front of him, not realizing how much I had gathered, how prepared I was to meet him. When the proceedings began, my lawyer spoke first, outlining the pattern we had uncovered. He described how consistent testimony showed I had been the one present in the home, the one providing daily support, the one carrying responsibility when decisions were made. Then he revealed how, during a difficult stretch of illness and fatigue, my brother had stepped in, not to help, but to steer. Witnesses confirmed he often spoke about my financial independence, convincing our parents they didn't need to set aside anything. Piece by piece, the evidence was laid out. The emails, the texts, the notes in my father's handwriting promising fairness. Then came the voices of those who had watched everything unfold, neighbors, friends, even the church volunteer who remembered me bringing meals week after. Their words painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Mark tried to interrupt, his voice sharp, insisting that he had only acted in their best interest. But every objection was met with more proof. My lawyer countered with calm precision, reminding the court that influence doesn't always come through shouting. It often comes in gentle, persistent persuasion, especially when directed at people already worn down. I kept my eyes on the judge, forcing myself not to flinch when Mark glanced my way. His confidence began to waver as the record grew longer, the details more damning. The smirk I had seen so many times faltered, replaced by a tight jaw and restless tapping fingers. Finally, the judge leaned forward, hands folded, and delivered the decision. The estate would not remain in Mark's sole control. It would be divided evenly, honoring the balance that had once been promised. The words carried more weight than I expected. I felt both vindication and sorrow all at once. Justice didn't erase what had been done, but it corrected the story that Mark had tried to write. As the room began to empty, I made my way to the evidence table. Resting there was the silver locket my brother had once tried to pocket, along with a few other small keepsakes. I claimed them without hesitation. They weren't just trinkets. They were fragments of memory that belonged to me as much as to anyone. Holding the locket in my hand, I felt something settle inside me. Mark left the courtroom with his head low, shoulders stiff, his arrogance stripped away. I walked out carrying the heirlooms close, not as trophies, but as proof that he hadn't succeeded in erasing me. What mattered most was mine again, and this time, it could never be taken. Once the judgment was carried out and the estate divided, I received my share of the assets. For the first time in my life, I had the freedom to make a decision that was entirely mine. I didn't keep the property, though. I knew Mark had plans for it, plans that depended on my cooperation. So I sold my portion to a buyer he despised, a man he'd once mocked as incompetent. Watching his face when he realized he couldn't move forward without someone he loathed was almost better than the court's ruling itself. His profits were cut down the middle, his vision of quick money collapsing right in front of him. I didn't linger in the wreckage. With my share of the funds, I took deliberate steps toward building a life untouched by the constant weight of obligation. I booked a trip I had been dreaming of for years, something I would never have allowed myself while running on empty. I bought a small but bright home in a neighborhood I chose for myself, with windows that filled the rooms with light in the morning. I upgraded the worn-out car that had carried me through countless late shifts, finally letting myself enjoy the comfort of something new. Each move I made wasn't about luxury, it was about choice. For the first time, I wasn't living out of duty or guilt. I wasn't patching holes or cleaning up after someone else. Every decision was mine, and every step reminded me that I had reclaimed something Mark had tried so hard to strip away, my sense of worth. He, on the other hand, spiraled in the opposite direction. Word spread quickly that his plans for the property had been sabotaged, and his reputation took a hit. Friends who once admired his confidence now avoided him, muttering about arrogance and greed. I didn't need to see him to know the anger was eating at him. It was in the silence of unanswered calls and the short, clipped messages he left when he realized I wouldn't engage. He was left standing in the shadow of everything he thought he controlled, stewing in bitterness while I quietly built something better. And that was enough for me. I didn't crave his apology, and I didn't seek reconciliation. Forgiveness wasn't part of this story. What I wanted was peace, and that came not from him, but from choosing myself at last. One evening, I sat in my new living room, suitcase still half unpacked from my trip, the silver locket resting on the table beside me. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer pressed down on me. For the first time in years, I felt light. I had taken back what mattered most. Not the money, not the property, but the knowledge that I hadn't been erased. I had carved out my place, and this time, no one could take it away. Do you think I made the right choice by standing up for myself and cutting Mark off? Or should I have tried to forgive him? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.